The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
If you can stomach the fact that you are unequipping the Sticky Bomb launcher, Demoman has a ton of options in his secondary weapon slot. If you weren't aware, Hybrid Knight refers to a Demoman who is using a grenade launcher as his primary, and one of the shields as his secondary. Before I get too ahead of myself, I should talk about weapon choices since the Demoman has so many options. For the primary slot, I would argue that either the Iron Bomber or the stock grenade launcher are the best choice. Obviously, in the context of this video, you can't run the booties or the bootlegger, and the loose cannon is a great weapon, but I don't associate it with Hybrid Knight. The loose cannon definitely deserves its own separate video. I have found that it is not ideal for Hybrid Knight because of its limited range, so I would not recommend running it with this playstyle in mind. The lock and load is another popular choice, and it is definitely good. I personally find the lock and load to be less fun than the Iron Bomber in stock, so I don't use it much anymore. Now for the age-old question. Should I use stock or Iron Bomber? Well, the two weapons are largely the same, so in most situations it doesn't matter. I personally use the Iron Bomber most of the time because its rollers are better, since if you barely miss a pipe, it will still usually deal damage. The larger explosion radius of stock is nice, but I find the unpredictability of its rollers unappealing, and the longer fuse time means that opponents have time to move out of the way if they are paying attention to where the roller is going. The Iron Bomber is also quicker to pipe jump with due to its shorter fuse time, which doesn't matter often, but it's something worth mentioning. The stock grenade launcher is better than the Iron Bomber in some niche situations. It has a longer range than the Iron Bomber, which can make a huge difference on Hybrid Knight because you don't have stickies. Spamming out some sentries can be much harder using the Iron Bomber for this reason. The stock grenade launcher also has a larger explosion like I mentioned previously, meaning that it can deal more damage if you manage to land a pipe in a large crowd. These differences rarely come up during a real game, so I've found the two to be largely interchangeable. Hybrid Knights have 3 shields to choose from. In my experience, the Charge and Targe is the only shield worth using as a Hybrid Knight because it has the highest damage resistances, thus increasing your effective health by the most. My playstyle as a Hybrid Knight is to land as many pipes as possible while staying alive, which this shield is the best at because of the damage resistances. I'll talk more about the Charge and Targe later in this video, but if you disagree and think the other shields are better, then go ahead and use them instead. Finally, there is the melee slot, which has a lot of options. Once again, I probably have an unpopular opinion here. I think that the stock melee is probably the best for Hybrid Knight. That being said, the Caber is what I typically run, but it is worse than stock because you have no up-close damage options that don't deal self-damage. I use the Caber most of the time because the chance of landing a charge crit on a large group of enemies is worth the downgrade. The Half Satoichi is the last melee I would consider viable for Hybrid Knight. Its main downsides are the slower equip speed, as well as the 50 damage on holster. If you're pulling out your melee, you are usually going to be in a pretty desperate situation, so the 50 damage on holster won't matter much since you're probably dead anyways unless you secure the melee kill. If you do get the kill, then the heal is awesome, especially on Hybrid Knight where that 88 HP is even more health because of the shield resistances. For this reason, the main downside of the Zatoichi is the unholster speed. I know a lot of people swear by the Eyelander, but for the Eyelander's upsides to outweigh the downsides, you need to be getting a few melee kills. Consistently finding a situation where you can get a melee kill without dying afterwards can be difficult, especially since you start with 15 less health with the Eyelander equipped. If you use your shield charge to go for a melee crit, you don't have the charge to retreat. This is probably going to depend on the opponents you're playing against, since if you're playing against paid Hectors, farming Eyelander heads is going to be really easy. Generally speaking, I find that the more I use my melee, the worse I do. Just to rattle off the rest of the melees real quick before I move on, the Persian Persuader is terrible for Hybrid Knight due to the ammo count stat. The Skullcutter's slower movement speed on unholster is not worth the extra damage in my opinion. The Claydham is alright, but I just don't feel the need to use my melee, and the extra charge length doesn't really help me when I'm playing Hybrid Knight. And lastly, the Pain Train is okay, I suppose, but I never use it because it doesn't fit my playstyle. I'm rarely pushing the cart or capturing myself, but I imagine it would be pretty good if you do those things frequently. Before I delve into my preferred playstyle, I should really cover Hybrid Knight's strengths and weaknesses since it will lead to a better understanding of the playstyle. The first main strength of Hybrid Knight is the additional health that the shield resistances grant you. The Charge and Targe grants a 50% fire resistance and a 30% explosive resistance. These are absolutely huge. The 50% fire resistance almost doubles the time it takes a Pyro to kill you. A Hybrid Knight with the Charge and Targe has over 300 health when fighting a Pyro who doesn't have a shotgun because bullet resistance is not a thing on the shield. The explosive resistance means that pipes will only deal 70 damage to the demo, meaning that instead of getting 2-shot, it will take 3 grenades to kill the Demoman. Similar to other resistances in TF2, these scale with heals, so an overheal from a medic is always going to be appreciated. A 260 health demo with the Charge and Targe is going to take close to 500 fire damage to kill, as opposed to the 260 needed to kill a regular demo. A full overheal increases the number of direct pipes to kill a Charge and Targe demo from 3 to 4. Don't forget that there is not bullet resistance on the Charge and Targe. Snipers will still hit you for 150 damage body shots, Scouts can still 2-shot you, Pyro can switch to a shotgun, and Heavy can still shred you. Also, if you let that dastardly Texan get close, he can kill you pretty quick as well. The second and final upside of running a shield is the mobility you get from the charges. If you didn't know, you can right-click the charge with a shield equipped. This ability is extremely useful since, unlike sticky jumping, you can use it basically instantly. A sticky jump requires you to wait for the 0.7 second arm time, and a loose cannon jump takes time to charge up. As far as I'm aware, charging with the shield is basically instantaneous. For this reason, I find that the shield charge is actually viable to make a quick escape from a bad fight. Of course, there is a cooldown time associated with your charge, so you will have to use it wisely. I should also mention that the charge mechanics are a bit wacky, and your charge can just break sometimes, so you need to be careful with how you use it. Using your charge will also cleanse you of any negative effects such as Afterburn or Bleed, as well as Jarate, Mad Milk, and the Gas Passer. This is mostly useful for using your shield to retreat, but it can save you during a fight too. Aside from retreating, I find myself using the charge offensively as well. If you have an advantage, you can use the shield to close distance on weak enemies, to aggressively reposition to the next point, and even to finish off low enemies. You do need to be a bit careful with this though, since your charge is your main escape tool. If you're caught in a bad situation with no charge, you're pretty much screwed unless you hit a good surf or manage to land all your grenades. Lastly, the shield's charge can be used for general mobility as well, such as rolling out or moving between health packs. The same rule applies here though, since if your charge is on cooldown, you need to position a bit more carefully until you get your get out of jail free card back. Moving on to the single yet multifaceted downside of the shields, the lack of the sticky bomb launcher. I know, sticky spam can be an unpopular way of playing TF2, but giving up the stickies is the only actual downside the shields have, and trust me when I say that this is a huge downside. Without the sticky bomb launcher, you can't use sticky traps, you can't sync stickies, you can't sync pipes and stickies, and you can't influence fights in your favor by limiting the other team's movement. You are sacrificing 2/3 of your ammo reserves as well, meaning you are going to run out of loaded ammo 3 times as quickly. When you equip a shield, you are essentially giving up around 2/3 of your damage dealing potential, as well as most of your area denial potential. I think almost everybody can appreciate the gravity of losing 2/3 of your damage, but the loss of area denial has its ramifications as well. Not having stickies means that holding doors is much harder for you, which essentially means your team is less effective at holding map control. This means that against competent players, the viability of Hybrid Knight is called into question. I can answer the question right now. It's not viable. Of course, pubs aren't usually filled with competent players. The viability of Hybrid Knight in a pub depends on your ability to connect your grenades. When I'm playing Hybrid Knight, I try to take advantage of my extra health and get out of jail free card by playing more aggressively than usual. The name of the game here is to position somewhere where I will connect more pipes than I usually would without the safety of the shield. I find myself on the front lines more often with the shield. Once I have spammed a few pipes and maybe secured a few frags, I will typically charge away to back up for health and ammo before walking forward to be aggressive again. This playstyle has a somewhat similar canter to regular Demoman, but instead of backing up to reload all your projectiles, you are instead getting health and ammo, which you will be losing more often than stock demo due to your aggressive positioning. This is a good time to point out that ammo management is important on Hybrid Knight since you only have a total of 20 grenades. Make sure to keep an eye on this count because you really don't want to run out of ammo in the middle of a firefight. Outside of this regular gameplay loop, Hybrid Knight does have a few other options depending on what loadout you choose. Like I mentioned before, it is very fun to run the Caber since if you time a charge crit right, you can one-shot most classes. I find I am most successful when charging small groups of enemies since even if I miss my charge a bit, I'm still usually within melee range of somebody and the explosion might hit multiple targets. If I charge at a large group of enemies, I usually die before I'm able to reach my targets. The Caber does around 200 damage if you can time the crit right, meaning that you will one-shot everyone but heavy if they're not overhealed. You will get a feel for the range you have to be at in order to land the crit over time. It is a bit further away than the ideal range for a Hybrid Knight, so I usually back up a little bit before charging in. You can Caber charge at larger groups of enemies of course, and if you pull it off you will do an absurd amount of damage. The problem with Demo Knight is very evident here, however. When you have to be in melee range to deal damage, you are putting yourself at risk. On paper, it is much better to be lobbing pipes at a large group of enemies at mid-range to achieve the same result while taking less damage. The Caber almost guarantees that you will die because of the self-damage on hit. Remember that when you decide to charge in aggressively, you do not have a charge to retreat, you will have to rely on your movement to escape. As far as the ideal playstyle goes, Hybrid Knight is relatively simple. Get value out of your shield charge and land lots of pipes. If you are struggling to hit anything with your grenades, here are a few tips. Remember that as a Demoman, you need to be aware of spacing. You are aiming to predict where somebody is going to be, not aiming right for them. At longer ranges, you will have to lead your pipes on the X-axis more than usual, assuming your opponents are not actively trying to dodge your grenades. You will also have to aim higher on the Y-axis at longer ranges as well due to the projectile arc. At longer ranges, hitting the Rex is much harder because the opponent has the time to react to your shots and move out of the way. At a certain range, it becomes theoretically impossible to land a direct hit grenade, assuming your opponent is playing perfectly. Ideally, in these situations, you would be using sticky bombs to influence the opponent's movement by limiting the directions they can travel in, and switching to pipes once you have them trapped. This is a video about Hybrid Knight, so I'm assuming you don't have sticky bombs, so in this case you will have to rely on your ability to predict your opponent's movement so that they walk into the pipe, and hope that they don't have a good enough reaction time to dodge it. It isn't as difficult to hit the Rex at this range in practice, since even very good players make mistakes, and they will very rarely be entirely focused on you. Like I mentioned earlier, I like to be aggressive when I'm playing Hybrid Knight because once you are within a certain range, pipes aren't possible to dodge by simply reacting to them. At this range, your opponent will have to attempt to make themselves difficult to predict by changing up their movement patterns. Against experienced players, hitting the Rex at this range is still very difficult, but it is much easier to do consistently. This short to medium range is my preferred spacing using this loadout. Similar to stock Demoman, you do not want to be at point blank range since you will be dealing self-damage. Thanks to your shield, you can tank more self-damage due to the explosive resistance, and you can always charge away if you have to, so it isn't quite as bad, but it is still not ideal. Regarding movement options that opponents have at this range, very good players will be abusing your field of view by strafing off of your screen. Tracking a scout at this range is particularly difficult, and hitting them with a grenade at this range is similarly very hard since you are again relying on prediction to guess where they are. Most players won't be able to pull this kind of movement off, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. The next tip I have for getting better at hitting pipes is spam lanes. Sometimes as a Demoman, knowing where to shoot is more effective than actually attempting to aim a pill at someone. The most obvious example of such is spamming an objective. A payload being pushed, a control point being capped, or a choke point that leads to an objective during a pub push are all great examples that can usually be recognized by simply being aware and looking at your HUD. There are other ways to get what is essentially free damage, such as recognizing that the other team seems to be standing in a certain area a lot, and spamming pipes at that area. This can be very effective on some maps since the arc of your pipe means that you don't even have to expose any of your hitbox in order to do this. In this case, projectiles that are arced over obstacles are an exception to the fact that long-range pipes are easy to dodge. If an opponent is standing in a spot with poor visibility, they will not be able to see the grenade coming until it is too late. You will learn these spam lanes over time, but I tried to show as many as I could in the background of this section. I should also mention that these lanes are pretty much always going to be more effective in competitive as opposed to casual, since in competitive you will have more information on what the other team is doing, meaning that you will have a better idea of when to spam certain angles. These angles are still quite strong in casual though, especially on maps like Viaduct and Upward. The next tip I have for landing more directs is to practice good crosshair placement. I'm certainly guilty of not doing this at times, and it does lose fights even in a game like TF2. This is a pretty well-known fundamental of first-person shooters, so there isn't really much to say other than to do it. If you are unfamiliar with this concept, crosshair placement just means that your crosshair should, in a perfect world, always be right where you are expecting to see an enemy so that, should you see them, you can start shooting at them right away. This can be difficult to do in TF2 because you should be turning around for spy quite a bit, but if you are able to keep this in mind, you will certainly win more fights. It is worth mentioning that the ideal crosshair placement for demo is going to be at or above head level depending on the range of the engagement you are anticipating. In certain situations, it can be good to aim your crosshair at center mass, since at close range your grenade will hit the opponent's feet, bouncing them into the air. A ton of players will spam jump when they are fighting a demo, so I find that it is best to aim higher so they can't jump over your grenade. The last tip I have for hitting more pipes is to notice how your opponents react to getting hit. As I mentioned before, pattern recognition is a big part of aiming as a Demoman. A common pattern I have noticed is that when you hit a direct on a player going left, they often change directions and start going right. If you notice a player does this, you can realize that your grenade is going to hit and immediately line up another grenade for a flashy 2-pipe kill. Sometimes more experienced players will continue going the same direction after getting hit in an attempt to break this pattern. This can be abused in a similar way. Alright, I think that is all the advice I have for now. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this video.
You're behind me? Okay, let's go kill the snipers.
Oh my god,
pussy
dude,
pop.
are you fucking serious?
Get him. The spy behind us. And a Demonite.
You guys are fucking dead.
Bro, can the medics not be overhealed, man?
That's the whole team.
You're gonna die. You just got jumped.
I just got jumped.